find efficiency savings or risk the sack. That's what civil servants have been told, apparently. They need to find ways to save money from their Whitehall budgets. Ministers are going to be announcing that. It's a drive to reduce government waste. And for the first time, senior officials will be held personally accountable for efficiency savings in their departments. I mean, is this just austerity by another name, something the left wing banged on about during the Cameron-Osborne era? What sort of savings could be made? Is it going to be enough? And realistically, will people face the chop if they don't live up to the expectations of the Treasury? Let's speak now to William Yarwood, who's a spokesperson for the Taxpayers Alliance. Hi, William. Without doubt, I mean, we've got Doge in America, don't we? We all love a bit of Doge. They seem to be taking Milei's metaphorical chainsaw to spending over there in the States. What is it that's going to be going on here? What are these efficiency savings going to look like? Where might the cuts be made? 5% on their budgets, apparently. Are people going to see their heads roll if they don't meet these targets?
Well, I certainly hope so, Alex, but I don't really have that much faith that civil servants will be punished for not meeting these targets. I mean, for crying out loud, when they're not allowed to work from home more than 4 days a week, they end up going on strike anyway. So, I mean, if they're forced to find these savings, they'll likely just go on strike and protest the cuts. But nevertheless, actually, the first place where the government could find some cuts is actually in the civil service itself. Delta poll actually found out that 39% of Labour voters are in favour of reducing the size of the civil service. That's Labour voters. That's not hardcore, right-wing tax cutting, voters. That's normal, ordinary Labour voters who think that the state's got too big. Maybe they should start there to begin with. I mean, the civil service is currently about 13.7% times bigger than His Majesty's Armed Forces, for crying out loud. So I think some cuts could actually start in the civil service. But, civil servants aren't really going to fire themselves, are they?
How do we compare to other countries when it comes to the size of the civil service?
Oh, we're pretty bad, Alex, if I'm perfectly honest with you. It's grown actually pretty exponentially since 2016. I mean, you mentioned a little earlier before the break about Cameron and austerity. One thing that Cameron and Osborne actually did quite well is reduce the civil service by about 150,000 over the first 5-6 years of their government. But actually, ever since 2016-17, the civil service has exploded, and COVID actually exacerbated that to the extent that now we have one of the biggest and most bloated states in the country. But to be quite frankly with you, a lot of these civil servants aren't really doing real jobs. A lot of them are doing DEI roles. A lot of them are doing middle management roles. I mean, middle management roles have exponentially increased just over the last 10 years. Frankly, a lot of these roles just need to be thrown out the window. And if Pat McFadden and Keir Starmer had any spine, maybe they say to civil servants, actually, we're going to find the efficiency savings and the reductions in government spending by getting rid of a lot of you.
I mean, do you think that that's on the cards? Might some of these leaders in the civil service, and they've got to take 5% off their budgets, have a look around their own offices and go, well, that person hasn't turned up to work for a while. They're clearly sitting under a slanket on their sofa doing 5% of what they're supposed to be doing. We can get rid of you. Or will these cuts likely impact on provisions sort of on the so-called front line?
Unfortunately, I think that it will impact the front line, and to some extent, I'm actually pretty sick to death of politicians, both in the Labour and the Tory party, talking constantly about the need to reduce the civil service and then never actually doing anything about it. I mean, Starmer talked about cutting about 100,000 civil servants from the civil service just a few months ago, and he was accused by the FDA, which is the trade union that looks after civil servants. He was accused of being a Trumpian populist. I mean, Keir Starmer couldn't get any further from being a Trumpian populist if you tried, but just because he suggested that maybe the state was a bit too big and civil servants were a bit too many, he's being accused of Trumpian populism. But Jeremy Hunt said this back when he was Chancellor under the last government. Boris Johnson said this when he was Prime Minister in 2022. And yet the last Conservative government saw an exponential rise in the size of the civil service, both due to COVID and the inability to actually implement, actually any real cost-cutting savings that they had after the COVID pandemic. So, yeah, quite frankly, I do hope that government ministers and the Prime Minister and Pat McFadden do have the spine to do this. But quite frankly, Alex, I'm not actually that hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, surely if repeatedly we're hearing governments and prime ministers and ministers say that we could shed 100,000 jobs in the civil service. That's a huge number of jobs. I mean, one can only imagine the savings that we'd get from that. Why can't it be done? Is this simply because their union managed to throw legal blockades in front of those proposals?
Yeah, it's partly to do with the union leadership. As I said earlier, I mean, the FDA, any time Keir Starmer criticises the civil service, he's called all sorts of names and told that he needs to calm down, otherwise he's sounding too right-wing, even though, of course, Keir Starmer is actually saying, something remarkably sensible. But also it's just due to the fact that I think our political class and our political elite like saying things that appease the public, like civil service cuts. As I said, civil service cuts are actually one of the core areas of the state which the majority of the public would happily see cut, but they just don't have the spine to do this, or even the know-how or the intelligence to do this, because actually a lot of our politicians lack any sort of a level of creative or political insight that actually in reality they genuinely need if they want to do the big reforms, the big changes, and the big cost efficiency savings that this country desperately needs.
I want to talk to you now about local councils, because we've heard that we know, for instance, there's not going to be elections in May, and I think it's 11 local authorities, because they're going to face new devolution measures. A lot more responsibility has been put on their shoulders. A lot of them are putting up council tax bills, some of them even going above the cap, which is supposed to stop them putting up council tax bills beyond a certain measure. And then equally, there's a number of them also going bust. How on earth are they going to fare over coming months?
Well, actually, again, if you look at the polling, the majority of the British public actually support cuts in local government, because they recognise that there's far too many town hall bosses behind the scenes earning extortionate salaries. I mean, we at the Taxpayers Alliance do a big piece of landmark research every single year called the Town Hall Rich List, where we reveal how many backroom bosses are on over 100,000, 150,000. I mean, we had to include a new section this year for over £200,000, and that's including, their salary, their expenses, their pension, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you're right to mention the council tax increase, actually. I mean, we've been out in Windsor and Maidenhead campaigning against the 25% hike, and luckily it was only put up by 9%. But even then, that's 9% more than it really should have been if the council was actually able to get its figures and its own house in order. I mean, I don't see why every time councils go bankrupt, every time councils do awful things with taxpayers' money, why they then go cap in hand to taxpayers to ask them to bail them out again. It's just completely and utterly wrong.
Do you think that there needs to be just basically a massive audit of local authorities, and particularly an audit, let's say, looking for fraud? Because I note that certainly some of the authorities that claim bankruptcy or claim, very tight financial margins have also featured in newspapers and generated headlines with some of their expenditure. For instance, one particular school pupil being ferried to a special needs school in a taxi, costing a local authority to the tune of millions of pounds per year. Do you think we've got a problem with not just waste, but also corruption at local level?
Yeah, totally. I wouldn't disagree with that at all. But again, it's whether our political elite has the spine to do something like this. And quite frankly, I don't think our political elite currently does. Like I said, if people want to find out more about town hall waste, feel free to go to the Taxpayers Alliance and read our town hall rich list. And you can see by your local authority, actually, if they've actually revealed their accounts. Because, Alex, a lot of local authorities very naughtily don't reveal their accounts and keep hidden how much their town hall bosses they're earning, what their expenses are, what their pensions are, how much they're spending on consultancy fees, and so on and so forth. But yeah, people can go and look at that and find out the truth. And I would say, vote to get rid of your councils. But like you said, millions of people are being denied the right to vote, or for reasons that are up for discussion, let's say.
Yeah, I think you're right. Reasons that really should be up for discussion. Unfortunately, we're not really discussing them enough. William Yarwood, spokesperson there from the Taxpayers Alliance. Right.